Margaret stood outside the prestigious Silverstone Music Academy, clutching her worn leather bag close to her chest. The building towered above her with its grand marble columns and polished glass doors that reflected the afternoon sun. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her simple cotton dress that had seen better days. Her shoes were clean but old, the kind bought from discount stores rather than boutiques. At 45 years old, Margaret had finally gathered the courage to pursue her lifelong dream of learning piano properly. The academy was known throughout the city as the place where only the elite sent their children. Wealthy families paid thousands of dollars for lessons from world-renowned instructors. The waiting list was typically years long, but Margaret had called every week for 6 months until someone canceled their enrollment. When the secretary reluctantly offered her the spot, Margaret had used all her savings from working double shifts at the diner to pay the first month's fee. As she pushed through the heavy doors, the cool air conditioning hit her face. The lobby was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers hanging from high ceilings and oil paintings of famous composers lining the walls. A grand piano sat in the corner, polished to perfection, looking more like a museum piece than an instrument. Margaret's heart raced with excitement mixed with fear. She had never been in a place this fancy before. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes, looked up from her computer. Her eyes scanned Margaret from head to toe and her smile faltered slightly. Margaret noticed the look but tried to ignore it. She had dealt with judgment her whole life for being a single mother who worked as a waitress. She was used to people underestimating her. Margaret approached the desk with as much confidence as she could gather. She gave her name and explained she was there for her first piano lesson. The receptionist typed slowly on her keyboard, her long manicured nails clicking against the keys. After what felt like an eternity, she pointed down a hallway without much warmth in her voice. Margaret thanked her and walked toward the practice rooms, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The hallway was lined with soundproof rooms where she could hear muffled music coming from behind closed doors. Through small windows, she glimpsed young students, most of them teenagers dressed in expensive clothes, playing complicated pieces with serious expressions. Margaret felt a knot forming in her stomach. Everyone here seemed so polished, so refined, so different from her. She found her assigned room and knocked gently. A voice called out for her to enter. Inside, she found Professor Vincent Ashford, a man in his 50s with silver hair slicked back and a tailored suit that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. He was arranging sheet music on the piano stand and barely glanced at her when she entered. Margaret introduced herself with a nervous smile, extending her hand for a handshake. Professor Ashford looked at her hand for a moment before giving it a quick limp shake. His eyes took in her appearance, and she saw the same look she had gotten from the receptionist. It was a look that said she did not belong here. He gestured for her to sit at the piano bench. Margaret sat down carefully, running her fingers lightly over the smooth keys. The instrument was beautiful, far superior to the old keyboard she practiced on at home. That keyboard had missing keys and sticky buttons, but it was all she could afford. She had taught herself basic songs over the years, watching free videos online and practicing whenever her 2 children were asleep. Professor Ashford stood behind her with his arms crossed. He asked her about her musical background in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer would disappoint him. Margaret explained honestly that she had no formal training, just a love for music that had been with her since childhood. She told him how her mother used to play piano at their small church, and how she had always dreamed of learning but never had the opportunity. The professor sighed loudly, making no effort to hide his displeasure. He muttered something under his breath about the academy lowering its standards. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept her composure. She had not come this far to let someone's rudeness stop her. He placed a beginner's music book in front of her, flipping to the first page with exaggerated movements. The piece was a simple children's song, something Margaret had actually learned years ago. Professor Ashford told her to play it, speaking slowly as if she might not understand basic instructions. Margaret positioned her hands over the keys, feeling the weight of his judgment pressing down on her shoulders. As she began to play, she could feel him watching critically. She made it through the simple melody without mistakes. But instead of any encouragement, Professor Ashford pointed out that her posture was wrong, her finger placement was amateur, and her timing was inconsistent. He spoke in a condescending tone that made Margaret feel small and foolish. For the next 45 minutes, he continued to criticize every aspect of her playing. He compared her unfavorably to his other students, mentioning their achievements and natural talents. He suggested that perhaps piano lessons were not a wise investment for someone her age with no background. He even implied that she might be taking a spot that could go to someone with real potential. Margaret sat through it all, nodding politely and trying to absorb any actual instruction hidden within his insults. She refused to cry, even though she felt the tears building behind her eyes. She thought about her children at home, about how hard she had worked to afford these lessons, about the dream she had carried in her heart for decades. She would not let this man's cruelty destroy what she had built. When the lesson finally ended, Professor Ashford dismissed her curtly, telling her to practice the basic exercises before next week. Margaret gathered her bag and left the room with her head held high, even though inside she felt crushed. As she walked back down the hallway, she passed other instructors chatting near the water cooler. They glanced at her and she heard whispered comments followed by quiet laughter. Outside the academy, Margaret stood on the steps and let herself take a shaky breath. The sun was setting, casting orange light across the city. She had an evening shift at the diner starting in an hour. There was no time to feel sorry for herself. She squared her shoulders and began the walk to the bus stop, already planning how she would practice tonight after work. They had mocked her today, treated her like she was worthless, but Margaret had survived worse. She had a secret these people knew nothing about, something that would surprise them all when the time was right. The weeks passed slowly for Margaret. Every Tuesday evening she arrived at the Silverstone Music Academy for her lesson with Professor Ashford, and every Tuesday evening, she left feeling smaller than when she arrived. The professor had not warmed to her at all. If anything, his contempt had grown more obvious with each passing week. He seemed to take pleasure in pointing out her mistakes, often in front of other students or instructors who happened to be nearby. Margaret continued working her shifts at the diner, serving coffee and meals to customers from dawn until afternoon. Then she would rush home, help her 2 children with homework, make dinner, and practice on her broken keyboard for whatever time remained. Her daughter Emma was 16 and her son David was 13. They both knew how much these lessons meant to their mother, even though she never complained about how she was being treated. At the academy, Margaret became somewhat of a joke among the staff. She would arrive in her simple clothes, carrying her weathered bag, and the whispers would start. The other students, mostly teenagers from wealthy families, would smirk when they saw her in the hallways. Some of the younger instructors made comments just loud enough for her to hear about people who did not understand their place in the world. During her 5th lesson, Professor Ashford was particularly harsh. Margaret had practiced a new piece all week, working on it until her fingers ached. She thought she had done well, but when she finished playing, the professor launched into a lecture about how some people simply lacked the natural ability for music. He suggested that she was wasting both her money and his valuable time. He said these things while the door to the practice room was open, and several people in the hallway paused to listen. Margaret felt humiliation wash over her, but she kept her expression neutral. She thanked him for the lesson and gathered her things. As she left, she heard laughter echoing from the hallway. She walked past the group of instructors who were not even trying to hide their amusement. One of them, a woman named Professor Diana Frost, said loudly enough for Margaret to hear that the academy really should have standards about who they accepted. That evening at the diner, Margaret's manager noticed she was quieter than usual. Martha had known Margaret for 15 years and could tell when something was wrong. During their break, Martha asked what was bothering her. Margaret explained about the lessons, about how she was being treated, about how she was starting to wonder if she should just quit and save her money. Martha, a woman in her 60s who had seen Margaret through many difficult times, shook her head firmly. She reminded Margaret of all the obstacles she had already overcome in her life. She talked about how Margaret had raised 2 children alone after her husband left them with nothing. She mentioned how Margaret had worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Martha told her that people who mocked others often did so because they felt threatened somehow. Margaret smiled at her friend's words, but inside she still felt the sting of the constant ridicule. What Martha did not know, what nobody at the academy knew, was that Margaret had a history with piano that ran deeper than anyone suspected. It was a part of her past she had kept hidden, a chapter of her life she rarely spoke about because it brought back painful memories. Before Margaret became a single mother working at a diner, before her life took its difficult turn, she had been someone different. In her early 20s, she had been a promising music student at a university in another state. She had won competitions and performed in concerts. Her professors had told her she had a gift, a rare talent that could take her far. Music had been her whole world, and the piano had been her voice. But then she met Robert, a charming man who swept her off her feet. She got pregnant with Emma, and Robert convinced her to leave school. He promised he would support her dreams, that she could return to music later. They married quickly, and then David came along 2 years after Emma. Robert's promises faded as quickly as his presence. He grew distant, staying out late, spending money they did not have. Margaret put her dreams on hold to take care of her babies and try to keep her marriage together. When Robert finally left, disappearing one night with no goodbye, Margaret was 28 years old with 2 small children and no money. Her piano, the beautiful instrument her grandmother had given her, had to be sold to pay rent. She moved to this city where living was cheaper, found work at the diner, and focused entirely on survival. Music became something she could only dream about in quiet moments. For 17 years, Margaret had not touched a real piano. Her skills had faded, her technique had grown rusty, and her confidence had disappeared. The old keyboard she practiced on now was nothing like the instrument she used to play, but the music was still inside her, sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. She had enrolled at the academy not just to learn again, but to reconnect with the part of herself she had lost all those years ago. Nobody at Silverstone Music Academy knew any of this. They looked at her and saw only a middle-aged waitress with delusions of grandeur. They did not see the girl who had once played Rachmaninoff with such emotion that audiences wept. They did not see the young woman who had won the state piano competition 2 years in a row. They saw only what they wanted to see, and what they wanted to see was someone beneath them. Margaret had not revealed her background because she wanted to start fresh. She wanted to relearn everything properly, to rebuild her foundation without the weight of past expectations. She also knew that if she told people about her history, they would either not believe her or would expect her to play at a level she could no longer reach. It had been too long. She needed time to rediscover her abilities, but the constant mockery was wearing her down. Every dismissive comment from Professor Ashford, every snicker in the hallway, every condescending look from the receptionist chipped away at her resolve. She began to doubt whether she could really reclaim what she had lost. Maybe too much time had passed. Maybe she was foolish to think she could pick up where she left off. Her children noticed her growing sadness. Emma, wise beyond her years, sat with her mother one evening and asked directly what was wrong. Margaret explained everything, and Emma surprised her by saying something profound. She told her mother that people who truly loved music would never mock someone trying to learn it. She said the teachers at that academy had forgotten what music was really about. She encouraged her mother to keep going, to prove them all wrong. David, usually quiet and reserved, added that his mother was the strongest person he knew. He said she had taught them never to give up, and now she needed to follow her own advice. The love and faith her children showed gave Margaret renewed strength. She decided she would continue the lessons, endure the mockery, and work harder than ever before. When the time was right, she would show them who she really was. 2 months into her lessons, the Silverstone Music Academy announced its annual spring recital. It was the biggest event of the year, held in the Grand Concert Hall downtown. Students would perform for an audience of parents, donors, and music enthusiasts from across the city. The event was also attended by critics from local newspapers and representatives from prestigious music schools. For many students, it was a chance to showcase their talents and potentially earn scholarships or recognition. Professor Ashford announced the recital during one of Margaret's lessons with obvious reluctance. He told her that all students were required to participate, even beginners. The way he said the word beginners while looking directly at her made his meaning clear. He assigned her a simple piece, something typically given to children in their first year of lessons. It was a basic Mozart minuet, pretty but unchallenging. Margaret accepted the assignment without complaint, but inside she felt a familiar fire beginning to burn. This was the moment she had been unconsciously waiting for. This was when she could choose to remain invisible, or step into the light and reclaim her identity as a musician, The decision frightened her because it meant being vulnerable, risking failure publicly, and facing the possibility that her skills really were gone forever. That evening, she sat at her old keyboard and did something she had not done in months. She played a piece from her past, a Chopin nocturne she had once performed in competition. Her fingers stumbled at first, searching for notes they had once known by heart. The melody came out broken and uncertain. Tears filled her eyes as she realized how much she had lost. But she kept playing, working through the piece measure by measure, and slowly, very slowly, muscle memory began to return. Over the next several weeks, Margaret lived a double life. During her lessons with Professor Ashford, she dutifully practiced the simple Mozart piece he had assigned. She accepted his criticisms and played the role of the struggling beginner he expected her to be. But at home, late into the night after her children were asleep, she worked on something else entirely. She was preparing a different piece for the recital, something that would shock everyone who had mocked her. She chose Liszt's La Campanella, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. It was a piece that required years of training, extraordinary finger dexterity, and deep musical understanding. It was a piece that professional pianists struggled with. Margaret had performed it once 20 years ago, and it had been her triumph. Now she would perform it again, not as a promising young student, but as a woman who had survived, endured, and refused to let her spirit be crushed. The preparation was brutal. Margaret's fingers, softened by years of not playing seriously, developed blisters that burst and bled. She wrapped them in bandages and kept practicing. She worked on sections over and over until they became smooth. She recorded herself and listened critically, fixing every imperfection. The old keyboard was inadequate for such a complex piece, but she made it work, imagining the sound of a real grand piano under her hands. Her children became her secret supporters. Emma would sit and listen during practice sessions, offering encouragement when Margaret became frustrated. David made sure his mother ate properly and got some rest. They understood that something important was happening, that their mother was fighting a battle that went beyond music. She was reclaiming a part of herself that had been buried for too long. At the academy, Margaret continued to be treated with disdain. Professor Ashford grew even more dismissive as the recital approached. During one lesson, he told her bluntly that she should consider playing an even simpler piece because he was concerned she might embarrass herself and, by extension, embarrass him and the academy. He suggested that perhaps she could simply skip the performance altogether. No one would miss her contribution. Margaret listened to his words with a calm expression, but inside she was smiling. She told him politely that she would be there and would do her best. Professor Ashford shook his head as if she were a lost cause and dismissed her early, saying he needed to prepare his real students for their performances. Margaret left the practice room and walked past a group of instructors gathered in the lounge. Professor Diana Frost was there, along with several others. As Margaret passed, Diana commented loudly about how unfortunate it was that they had to include everyone in the recital, regardless of ability. Another instructor joked about whether they should have a special beginners section so the audience could get their bathroom breaks. The group laughed, and Margaret heard one of them say something about the waitress playing piano. She kept walking, her face burning, but her resolve strengthening with every step. The week before the recital, Margaret made a decision that terrified her. She went to the concert hall where the event would be held and asked if she could practice there one evening. The facility manager, an older gentleman named Mr. Chen, was kind to her. He had seen many students come and go over the years and had learned not to judge by appearances. He agreed to let her use the hall for an hour after his staff had left for the day. That evening, Margaret stood alone on the stage of the grand concert hall. The space was enormous, with rows of velvet seats stretching back into darkness. The stage lights were bright and hot. In the center of the stage sat a magnificent concert grand piano, the finest instrument Margaret had ever seen. Her hands trembled as she approached it and sat down on the bench. She opened the lid and touched the keys. The sound that came out was like nothing she had heard in 20 years. It was pure, rich, and responsive. Every note sang with clarity. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she began to play La Campanella. The piece flowed from her fingers with increasing confidence. The acoustics of the hall carried every note beautifully. For those precious minutes, she was not a waitress or a single mother or an object of ridicule. She was a pianist. Mr. Chen, who had been working in his office, heard the music and came to listen. He stood in the back of the hall, amazed by what he was hearing. When Margaret finished, he approached the stage and told her it was one of the most moving performances he had witnessed in all his years at the concert hall. He asked why she was taking beginner lessons when she clearly had professional-level skills. Margaret explained her situation, her past, and how she had been treated at the academy. Mr. Chen listened with growing anger on her behalf. He told her that true musicians recognized and nurtured talent wherever they found it. He said the instructors at Silverstone had forgotten the very essence of what it meant to teach music. He encouraged her to play at the recital exactly as she had just played for him. He promised to be in the audience to support her. Margaret left the concert hall that night feeling something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt powerful. She felt like herself. The scared, apologetic woman who had walked into the academy months ago was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth and was ready to claim it. The mockery she had endured had not broken her. Instead, it had forged her into something stronger. The night before the recital, Margaret could not sleep. She lay in bed thinking about what would happen the next day. She thought about the looks on the faces of Professor Ashford and the other instructors when they realized who she really was. She thought about all the students who had smirked at her in the hallways. She thought about every dismissive comment and condescending laugh. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the humble woman they had mocked would reveal her secret. The morning of the recital arrived with bright sunshine streaming through Margaret's small apartment windows. She woke early, her stomach tight with nerves but her mind clear and focused. Emma had ironed her mother's best dress the night before, a simple navy blue dress that was modest but elegant. David had polished her shoes until they shined. Her children were more excited than she had seen them in years. At the diner, Martha noticed Margaret's distraction during the morning shift. When Margaret explained about the recital that evening, Martha immediately told her to leave early. She said some things were more important than serving coffee, and this was definitely one of those things. She hugged Margaret tightly and told her to show those snobby teachers what she was made of. Several regular customers who had gotten to know Margaret over the years overheard and wished her luck. Margaret arrived at the concert hall 3 hours before the recital was scheduled to begin. The backstage area was chaos, with students warming up in practice rooms, parents fussing over their children's appearance, and instructors giving last-minute instructions. Margaret found a quiet corner and sat alone, running through the piece in her mind. She visualized every note, every hand position, every dynamic change. She had prepared for this moment as thoroughly as possible. Professor Ashford appeared backstage, clipboard in hand, checking on his students. When he saw Margaret sitting alone, he approached with a frown. He asked if she was planning to wear that dress for the performance, his tone suggesting it was not appropriate. Margaret looked down at her dress, which was clean, pressed, and perfectly respectable, and told him politely that yes, she was. He sighed and reminded her that she was playing near the beginning of the program with the other beginners. He emphasized that she should not take too long and should try not to make any embarrassing mistakes. What Professor Ashford did not know was that Margaret had made a change to the program. Earlier that week, she had gone to see the Academy's director, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a woman in her 70s who had founded the school 40 years ago. Margaret had requested a private meeting and had explained her situation honestly. She told Dr. Morrison about her background, about how she had been treated by the staff, and about what she planned to do at the recital. Dr. Morrison had listened carefully. She was disappointed to learn how her instructors had been treating a student, especially one with Margaret's history. She examined the old newspaper clippings and competition certificates Margaret had brought as proof of her past accomplishments. Dr. Morrison agreed to let Margaret make one change to the program. Instead of playing with the beginners, Margaret would perform last in the spot reserved for the most advanced students. The printed programs would still list her original piece, but she would play what she chose. As the concert hall began to fill with audience members, Margaret peeked through the backstage curtains. The seats were filling quickly. She saw wealthy parents in expensive clothes, students from other music schools, and critics with their notebooks. She spotted Mr. Chen sitting near the front, giving her a subtle nod of encouragement. She also saw Emma and David with Martha, who had closed the diner early to attend. The sight of her children sitting proudly in the audience made Margaret's eyes water. The recital began promptly at 7 o'clock. Dr. Morrison gave a welcoming speech, talking about the tradition of excellence at Silverstone Music Academy and introducing the evening's performances. The youngest students went first, playing simple pieces with earnest concentration. Parents applauded enthusiastically after each performance. Margaret watched from backstage, her heart pounding harder with each passing minute. The beginner section came and went without Margaret's name being called. Professor Ashford looked confused, searching through his papers trying to figure out why his student had been skipped. He found Margaret backstage and demanded to know what was going on. Margaret simply told him to wait and see. Her calm response confused him, and he walked away muttering about unprofessional behavior. As the recital progressed through intermediate and advanced students, the quality of performances increased dramatically. These were talented young people playing challenging pieces with skill and confidence. Professor Diana Frost's star pupil, a 17-year-old named Sebastian, received thunderous applause for his performance of a difficult Beethoven sonata. Diana stood backstage beaming with pride, already imagining the accolades her student would receive. The recital was nearing its end when Dr. Morrison returned to the stage. She announced that there would be one final performance, a change from the printed program. She explained that the Academy had a student who had been hiding her light under a basket, someone whose story embodied the true spirit of music and perseverance. She invited Margaret to the stage. The audience looked confused, flipping through their programs trying to find information about this unexpected performer. Backstage, Professor Ashford's face went pale. Professor Diana Frost frowned, annoyed that the program had been changed without her knowledge. The other instructors whispered among themselves, wondering what was happening. They watched in disbelief as Margaret, the woman they had mocked for months, walked confidently onto the stage. Margaret crossed the stage with her head high, her simple dress a stark contrast to the elaborate outfits worn by the other performers that evening. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could sense the confusion and curiosity in the audience. She reached the magnificent grand piano and adjusted the bench to the right height. She closed her eyes for a moment, said a silent prayer, and then looked out at the audience. She began to speak, her voice clear and steady despite her nerves. She thanked Dr. Morrison for the opportunity to perform. She talked briefly about her journey, about being a single mother who had put her dreams on hold to raise her children. She mentioned that she had once been a serious piano student many years ago, but life had taken her in a different direction. She said tonight was about reclaiming a part of herself she thought was lost forever. In the audience, Emma and David were crying happy tears, proud beyond words of their mother's courage. Martha was gripping the armrests of her seat, barely breathing. Mr. Chen sat forward, eager to hear the performance he knew was coming. The critics and music enthusiasts in the audience were intrigued, wondering if this unusual setup would lead to something memorable or merely embarrassing. Backstage, the instructors watched the monitor showing the stage. Professor Ashford was shaking his head, certain he was about to witness a disaster that would reflect poorly on him. Professor Diana Frost looked annoyed at what she considered a stunt that cheapened the serious recital. The younger instructors exchanged glances, some feeling guilty about how they had treated Margaret, others still skeptical that anything impressive would come from this woman they had dismissed so easily. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and took one final deep breath. The concert hall fell into complete silence. Even the critics stopped writing in their notebooks. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of months of secret practice and years of deferred dreams. Margaret's fingers touched the keys and she began to play La Campanella. The first notes rang out clear and precise, immediately capturing everyone's attention. The piece began with its famous bell-like melody, and Margaret's execution was flawless. Her fingers moved across the keys with speed and accuracy that seemed impossible. The difficult leaps and rapid passages that caused even advanced students to struggle came from her hands effortlessly. She played with technical brilliance, but also with deep emotion that breathed life into every phrase. The transformation in the concert hall was immediate and powerful. What had begun as curious silence quickly became stunned amazement. Margaret's performance of La Campanella was not just technically proficient, it was breathtaking. Her fingers danced across the keys with a speed and precision that left the audience mesmerized. The difficult octave passages that typically caused pianists to stumble came from her hands smoothly and confidently. In the audience, people who had been casually listening suddenly sat up straight. The music critics stopped writing and simply listened, their expressions showing their surprise. Parents who had come to support their own children found themselves captivated by this unexpected performer. The piece itself is known for its difficulty, requiring absolute control and years of serious training. Yet Margaret played it as if it were written specifically for her. Backstage, the scene was even more dramatic. Professor Ashford stood frozen, his mouth slightly open in shock. His hands had gone numb and his clipboard had slipped from his fingers onto the floor without him noticing. This could not be the same woman he had dismissed as talentless week after week. This could not be the beginner he had insulted and looked down upon. Yet there she was on the monitor, playing one of the most challenging pieces in piano literature with the skill of a concert pianist. Professor Diana Frost had gone pale, her usual confident expression replaced by disbelief. She prided herself on her ability to recognize talent. Yet she had completely missed what was right in front of her. She had mocked this woman in hallways, made jokes about her in the teacher's lounge, and treated her with contempt. Now she was witnessing a performance that surpassed anything her own prize student Sebastian had done that evening. The other instructors stood in silence, watching the monitor with growing realization of their collective mistake. The young receptionist who had looked down at Margaret on her first day was there too, her perfectly made-up face showing shame. Some of the teenage students who had smirked at Margaret in the hallways now watched with wide eyes, understanding that they had mocked someone far beyond their own level of skill. On stage, Margaret was lost in the music. She was no longer in the concert hall, but somewhere else entirely, a place where only the music existed. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythms, her face showing every emotion the piece demanded. The famous bell-like sounds rang out crystal clear. The rapid chromatic runs sparkled like light on water. The powerful chords in the middle section thundered with perfect timing and weight. Margaret's hands moved in patterns that seemed almost impossible. Her left hand played supporting harmonies, while her right hand flew across the upper registers with lightning speed. The coordination required was extraordinary. One moment her hands were far apart, the next they crossed over each other seamlessly. She executed trills and grace notes with clarity. Every phrase was shaped with musical intelligence, showing not just technical ability but deep artistic understanding. Emma and David were crying openly now, not caring who saw them. They had never heard their mother play like this. They knew she loved music and had once been good at it, but they had no idea she possessed this level of mastery. They understood now why she had endured the mockery and kept going to those lessons despite how she was treated. She had been building toward this moment, reclaiming her identity note by note. Martha was overwhelmed with emotion. She had known Margaret for 15 years, had seen her struggle through poverty and hardship, had watched her sacrifice everything for her children. But she had never imagined that her friend possessed this extraordinary gift. She thought about all those mornings Margaret had served coffee with tired eyes after staying up late to practice. Every blister on Margaret's fingers, every moment of discouragement, had led to this triumph. Mr. Chen watched with tears streaming down his weathered face. He had heard thousands of performances in this concert hall over his decades of working there. He had heard famous pianists and talented students, but something about Margaret's performance touched him deeply. Perhaps it was knowing her story, understanding the courage it took to stand on that stage after months of humiliation. Or perhaps it was simply the beauty of the music itself, played with such passion and skill. The music critics in the audience were scribbling furiously in their notebooks now. They recognized immediately that they were witnessing something special, not just a good performance, but a story that their readers would want to know about. One critic, a man named James Patterson, who had reviewed concerts for the city's major newspaper for 30 years, was already forming the headline in his mind. This was the kind of human interest story that transcended typical concert reviews. As Margaret moved into the final section of La Campanella, the technical demands became even more intense. The piece builds to a climax that requires the pianist to play rapid, repeated notes with absolute evenness, while simultaneously managing complex harmonies. Many professional pianists struggle with this section. Margaret attacked it fearlessly, her fingers moving so fast they became a blur. The repeated notes chimed out like actual bells, each one perfectly even and clear. The climax arrived with powerful chords that rang through the concert hall, And then the piece concluded with a final flourish of rapid notes ascending to the highest register of the piano. Margaret played the last note and lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment, silence filled the concert hall. It was the kind of silence that comes after something profound, when an audience needs a moment to process what they have just experienced. Then the applause began. It started with a few people and quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. The entire audience rose to their feet, something that had not happened for any other performer that evening. People were not just clapping politely, they were cheering, shouting their appreciation, whistling their approval. The standing ovation continued for what felt like minutes, wave after wave of applause washing over Margaret as she stood by the piano. Margaret stood on stage, overwhelmed by the response. She had hoped to play well, to prove to herself that she still had her abilities, but she had not expected this kind of reaction. She looked out at the audience and saw strangers on their feet applauding wildly. She saw Mr. Chen wiping his eyes. She saw her children and Martha jumping up and down with joy. She saw the music critics nodding with approval as they continued to clap. She took a bow, tears running freely down her face now. These were not tears of sadness or humiliation, like the ones she had held back during those cruel lessons. These were tears of joy, of vindication, of reclaiming something precious that had been taken from her. She had walked into this concert hall as someone invisible and dismissed. She was leaving as someone who could no longer be ignored. Backstage, the mood was somber among the instructors. They had to walk past that monitor showing Margaret taking her bows to the continuing applause. They had to face what they had done, how they had treated someone of extraordinary talent with cruelty and disdain. Professor Ashford looked like he might be sick. His face had gone from pale to slightly green. His hands were shaking as the reality of his behavior toward Margaret crashed down on him. Professor Diana Frost had recovered some of her composure, but her eyes showed a deep shame. She was a woman who prided herself on her professionalism and her eye for talent. Tonight she had been exposed as someone who judged by appearances rather than ability, who let prejudice cloud her judgment. She knew that everyone who had witnessed this performance would remember how she and the other instructors had treated Margaret. Her reputation, so carefully built over years, had been damaged in the span of one 12-minute piano performance. Dr. Morrison stood in the wings watching Margaret on stage, a slight smile on her face. She had known this would happen. She had seen Margaret's certificates and competition awards. She had believed Margaret when she explained her past. Dr. Morrison had founded this academy to nurture talent and inspire a love of music. Watching Margaret's triumph reminded her of why she had devoted her life to music education. It also showed her how far some of her instructors had strayed from those founding principles. The applause finally began to fade as Margaret left the stage. She walked into the wings where Dr. Morrison was waiting with open arms. The elderly director embraced her warmly, whispering that she was proud of her courage and talent. Behind Dr. Morrison stood the instructors who had mocked Margaret for months, and they looked like they wished the floor would open up and swallow them whole. Professor Ashford could not meet Margaret's eyes. He stood there in his expensive suit, the man who had told her she was wasting his time, who had suggested she had no talent, who had compared her unfavorably to his other students. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. What could he possibly say that would matter now? Margaret looked at him calmly, without anger or triumph, just a quiet dignity that made his shame even deeper. Professor Diana Frost stepped forward, her usual confidence shaken. She attempted an apology, her words coming out stilted and awkward. She said she had made a terrible mistake, that she should have looked beyond appearances. Margaret listened politely but said little in response. She was not interested in their apologies at that moment. She had not performed to gain their approval or to make them feel guilty. She had performed for herself, to prove to herself that she was still the musician she once was. As Margaret made her way through the backstage area, other students approached her. Some of the teenagers who had smirked at her in hallways now looked embarrassed. Sebastian, Professor Frost's star pupil who had performed so well earlier, approached Margaret with genuine admiration. He told her that her performance was the best he had ever heard live, better than many professional concerts he had attended. He asked if she would consider giving him some advice about his own playing. Margaret was gracious with everyone who approached her, but she was eager to get to the lobby where her children were waiting. When she finally emerged from backstage, Emma and David rushed to her. They wrapped her in a tight hug, all three of them crying and laughing at the same time. Martha joined them, forming a group embrace that drew smiles from people passing by. Mr. Chen approached and shook Margaret's hand warmly. He told her again how moving her performance had been, and said she was welcome to practice in the concert hall anytime she wished. He also mentioned that several people had already asked him about her, wanting to know who she was and where she had trained. He suspected she would be receiving some interesting opportunities in the coming days. Indeed, several people approached Margaret in the lobby. One was James Patterson, the veteran music critic. He asked if he could interview her for his newspaper. He explained that her story was exactly the kind of thing that needed to be told, a reminder that talent and worth are not determined by someone's job or appearance. Margaret agreed to the interview, though she was nervous about being in the newspaper. Another person who approached was Dr. Helena Reeves, who ran a community music program that provided free lessons to children from low-income families. She had been in the audience as a guest and was deeply moved by both Margaret's performance and the story Dr. Morrison had shared before it. She asked Margaret if she would consider teaching piano at the community center. She explained that the children there needed instructors who understood what it meant to struggle, who had overcome obstacles, and who truly loved music. Margaret was overwhelmed by the offer. Teaching had never occurred to her. She had only just rediscovered her own abilities. But the idea appealed to her deeply. She thought about how different her experience at Silverstone Academy might have been if she had encountered teachers who nurtured rather than mocked, who inspired rather than discouraged. She told Dr. Reeves she would think about it seriously. The next morning, Margaret's phone rang early. It was Dr. Morrison calling to inform her that there would be an emergency meeting at the academy to discuss what had happened at the recital. Dr. Morrison explained that several board members had been present at the performance and had witnessed how the instructors behaved backstage. They were not happy about how Margaret had been treated, especially after learning she had been mocked and discouraged for months despite paying for lessons. Dr. Morrison asked Margaret if she would be willing to attend the meeting to share her experience. Margaret hesitated. She had made her point at the recital. Did she really want to revisit all those painful memories? But then she thought about other students who might be treated the same way. People who might give up on their dreams because instructors judged them unfairly. She agreed to come. That afternoon's meeting was tense. Margaret sat in a conference room with Dr. Morrison, several board members, and the instructors who had been part of her story. Professor Ashford looked exhausted, like he had not slept. Professor Diana Frost sat stiffly in her chair, her usual commanding presence diminished. The younger instructors who had participated in mocking Margaret looked nervous and guilty. Margaret told her story honestly and completely. She explained how she had been treated from her very first day at the academy. She described the condescending comments, the mockery in the hallways, the suggestions that she was wasting everyone's time. She talked about how she had continued despite the cruelty, because her dream of reconnecting with music was stronger than their attempts to break her spirit. She also explained why she had not revealed her background initially, wanting to rebuild her skills from the foundation up. The board members listened with growing anger and disappointment. One of them, a distinguished woman named Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, who had donated generously to the academy for years, spoke up. She said she was appalled at what she was hearing. She pointed out that the academy's mission statement specifically mentioned nurturing all students regardless of their background. She said the behavior Margaret described was antithetical to everything the academy claimed to stand for. Professor Ashford was asked to explain his treatment of Margaret. He stammered through an explanation that basically amounted to admitting he had judged her based on her appearance and assumed she lacked talent. He claimed he was simply being realistic about her potential. Dr. Morrison cut him off sharply, pointing out that his job was to teach, not to decide who deserved to be taught. She reminded him that every student who paid for lessons deserved respect and proper instruction. Professor Diana Frost was addressed next. She at least had the grace to offer a sincere apology without making excuses. She acknowledged that she had participated in mocking Margaret and had failed to uphold professional standards. She admitted that she had let snobbishness and prejudice influence her behavior. She accepted responsibility and asked what she could do to make amends. The meeting lasted for 3 hours. By the end, several decisions had been made. Professor Ashford was placed on probation and required to attend professional development training focused on teaching ethics and recognizing bias. If there were any future complaints about his treatment of students, he would be terminated. He would also be required to write a formal apology to Margaret. The other instructors who had participated in mocking Margaret received formal warnings in their files. The Academy would be implementing new policies about how instructors interacted with adult learners and students from diverse backgrounds. There would be mandatory training for all staff on respect, professionalism, and the mission of music education. Dr. Morrison also made Margaret an offer that surprised everyone in the room. She asked Margaret to join the faculty as an instructor, specifically to work with adult learners and students who came to piano later in life. She would be paid well, better than what she made at the diner. She could set her own schedule around her children's needs. Dr. Morrison explained that Margaret's experience and talent would be invaluable, and her presence would help ensure the Academy lived up to its stated values. Margaret was stunned. She had walked into this academy months ago as a student seeking lessons, endured mockery and discouragement, and now she was being offered a position as an instructor. It felt surreal. She looked around the conference table at the faces watching her. She saw hope in Dr. Morrison's eyes, shame in Professor Ashford's expression, and support from the board members. She thought about Dr. Reeves's offer to teach at the community center. She thought about her children and the example she wanted to set for them. She thought about all the people out there who had dreams but felt they were too old, too poor, too ordinary to pursue them. She realized she could help those people in a way that someone who had never struggled could not. Margaret accepted Dr. Morrison's offer with one condition. She wanted to continue working part-time at the diner. Martha and the regular customers there had supported her through everything, and she was not going to abandon them. Dr. Morrison agreed immediately, impressed by Margaret's loyalty. They worked out a schedule where Margaret would teach at the academy 3 afternoons a week and keep her morning shifts at the diner. The newspaper article about Margaret appeared 2 days after the recital, and it changed everything. James Patterson had written a beautiful piece that told her story with sensitivity and insight. The headline read, "From Diner to Concert Hall, a mother's secret talent silences her critics." The article went viral online, shared thousands of times across social media platforms. People were moved by Margaret's story of perseverance, inspired by her courage to pursue her dreams despite mockery. Suddenly, Margaret was receiving messages from people all over the country. Other adult learners wrote to thank her for showing that it was never too late to pursue your passion. Single mothers told her she had given them hope. People who had been discouraged by teachers or told they lacked talent shared their own stories of persistence. Margaret was overwhelmed by the response, but also deeply touched. She had not realized how many people needed to hear a story like hers. The Academy experienced its own transformation. The publicity from Margaret's story brought attention to Silverstone, but not all of it was positive. Several articles and social media posts criticized the institution for allowing its instructors to treat students with such contempt. Some donors questioned whether they wanted to continue supporting a school with such problems. Dr. Morrison had to work hard to repair the Academy's reputation, using Margaret's hiring as an instructor as evidence of real change. Professor Ashford struggled with the aftermath of the recital. His reputation among the music teaching community suffered significantly. Several of his advanced students requested transfers to other instructors, not wanting to be associated with someone who had been exposed as cruel and dismissive. He completed his required training, but something had fundamentally changed in him. He became quieter, less arrogant, and more careful about how he spoke to students. Whether this change was genuine or simply self-preservation remained to be seen. Professor Diana Frost handled the situation differently. She reached out to Margaret privately and asked for a real conversation, not as colleagues but as human beings. Over coffee, she opened up about her own insecurities and how she had let those insecurities manifest as snobbery and cruelty. She explained that she had grown up wealthy and had never learned to see beyond surface appearances. Margaret's performance had forced her to confront her own biases in a way nothing else had. Margaret listened and accepted Diana's apology. She understood that people were complicated, that even those who hurt us are often dealing with their own struggles. She did not forget what had happened, but she chose not to let bitterness consume her. Diana asked if they could start over, and Margaret agreed to try. Over time, they developed a respectful working relationship, though they never became close friends. Margaret's first day as an instructor at Silverstone Academy was emotional. She walked through the same doors she had entered months earlier, feeling invisible and inadequate. But now she walked in as a teacher. The receptionist who had once looked down at her greeted her warmly, calling her Professor Williams. Margaret had to stop and collect herself, overwhelmed by how far she had come. Her first student was a 62-year-old retired accountant named Robert Chen, no relation to Mr. Chen from the concert hall. Robert had always wanted to learn piano, but had spent his life focused on his career and family. Now retired, he was finally pursuing his dream, though he was terrified he was too old to learn. Margaret saw herself in his nervous smile and hesitant questions. She sat down with Robert and told him her story. She explained that she understood his fear because she had felt it too. She promised him that in her classroom, there would be no judgment, no mockery, no suggestion that he was wasting anyone's time. She would meet him where he was and help him grow at his own pace. By the end of that first lesson, Robert was playing simple melodies with a joy that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Word spread quickly about Margaret's teaching style. She was patient, encouraging, and skillful at breaking down complex techniques into manageable steps. But what set her apart was her empathy. She understood what it felt like to be dismissed and discouraged, so she made sure every student felt valued and capable. Her class roster filled up immediately, mostly with adult learners who had been intimidated by traditional music instruction. At the diner, Margaret continued her morning shifts. Martha teased her about being a famous piano teacher now, but their friendship remained unchanged. The regular customers loved hearing stories about Margaret's students and her new life. They felt like they had been part of her journey, cheering her on through the difficult months. Margaret never forgot that these people had supported her when she felt most alone. Margaret also accepted Dr. Reeves's offer to teach at the Community Music Center one evening a week. These classes were her favorite. The students were children from families that could never afford expensive lessons at places like Silverstone. They had raw talent and enormous enthusiasm, but few opportunities. Margaret saw herself in their eager faces, remembering the little girl who had watched her mother play piano at church and dreamed of doing the same. She used everything she had learned from her own experience to be the kind of teacher she wished she had encountered. She never dismissed a student's potential based on their background. She never mocked someone for struggling with a difficult passage. She celebrated small victories and encouraged students through setbacks. Her students adored her, not just for her skill but for her genuine care for their growth. Emma and David watched their mother blossom into someone they barely recognized, yet somehow more herself than she had ever been. Emma, who would be graduating high school soon, told her mother that watching her pursue her dream had inspired her to be bolder about her own ambitions. David, who had always been shy, started taking piano lessons from his mother and discovered he had inherited her musical talent. 6 months after the recital, Silverstone Academy held another performance. This time, Margaret performed as a faculty member alongside other instructors in a concert celebrating the Academy's 40th anniversary. She chose to play a Chopin nocturne, the same piece she had played on her old keyboard the night she decided to prepare for that life-changing recital. The performance was beautiful and deeply moving, but what made Margaret most proud was watching her own students perform earlier in the program. Robert Chen, the retired accountant, played a simple piece he had learned in his first months of study. He was nervous and made a few mistakes, but he played with such joy that the audience gave him warm applause. Margaret sat in the front row, beaming with pride. This was what music education should be about, she thought. Not creating professional musicians necessarily, but helping people discover the joy and fulfillment that music could bring to their lives. After the concert, several of Margaret's former critics approached her. Some offered genuine congratulations and thanks for changing the culture at the Academy. Others maintained a polite distance, still uncomfortable about what had happened. Margaret was gracious with everyone, holding no grudges but also not pretending that the past had not happened. Dr. Morrison pulled Margaret aside during the reception after the concert. The elderly director told her that enrollments at the Academy had actually increased since Margaret joined the faculty. More importantly, the types of students enrolling had changed. There were more adult learners, More people from diverse backgrounds, more individuals who had been scared off by the Academy's previous elitist reputation. Margaret had not just changed the Academy's culture, she had helped it fulfill its mission more authentically. As Margaret drove home that night, she reflected on the incredible journey of the past year. She had walked into the Silverstone Academy as a humble woman, seeking to reconnect with a lost part of herself. She had endured mockery, contempt, and discouragement. She had been judged by her appearance, her job, and her age, but she had persisted because the music in her heart was stronger than the cruelty of others. Her secret skills, hidden for so long, had finally been revealed not just to silence her critics but to open doors she never imagined possible. She was teaching music, helping others discover their own hidden talents, and showing people that it was never too late to pursue your dreams. She had turned pain into purpose, humiliation into triumph, and mockery into a mission to treat others with the dignity everyone deserved. Margaret thought about all the people who had supported her along the way. Martha, who had believed in her when she doubted herself. Mr. Chen, who had given her encouragement at a crucial moment. Dr. Morrison, who had seen her potential and given her opportunities. Emma and David, whose love and pride had sustained her through the darkest moments. Even the critics like Professor Ashford and Professor Diana Frost had played a role, though unintentionally, in forging her into someone stronger. Most importantly, Margaret had rediscovered herself. She was no longer just a waitress or just a single mother. She was Margaret Williams, pianist and teacher, a woman with a remarkable story of resilience and redemption. She had proven that worth is not determined by circumstances, that talent can survive years of dormancy, and that courage and persistence can overcome even the cruelest judgment. As she pulled into her parking spot at the modest apartment building she called home, Margaret smiled. Tomorrow she would wake up early for her shift at the diner, serve coffee to regulars who knew her story, then head to the academy to teach students who looked at her with respect and admiration. It was not the life she had imagined for herself 20 years ago, but in many ways it was better. She had earned every note of it through determination, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that she deserved to pursue her passion. The humble woman who had been mocked at the piano had revealed her secret skills and transformed not just her own life but touched countless others. Her story would be told and retold, inspiring people to pursue their own hidden dreams, to persist in the face of discouragement, and to never let anyone else define their worth or potential. Margaret Williams had silenced her critics not with words but with music, and that music would echo far beyond the walls of any concert hall.